Good day, economic students. This video is for work chart 3, activity 1, 2, and 3. Economics 2B. Okay, activity 1 says assume capital to be measured on the vertical axis and labor on the horizontal axis. This is the graph that I've drawn, given the assumption that capital is on the vertical side and labor on the horizontal side. The price ratio of this graph will be price of labor over price of capital. Okay, and then the statement continues to say the result of an increase in the production budget, everything else constant, is a change or no change in the price ratio of the two inputs. So the answer here, I've highlighted that there'll be no change. The reason is a production budget focuses on the estimate of a number of units that must be produced or manufactured in order to meet a sales goals. Let's say, for an example, company A has a goal of producing and selling goods that are worth 100,000. So their production budget would focus on how many units should they produce in order for them to reach that goal. That's what a production budget looks at. So it has no, it does not affect the price ratio of capital and labor. Okay, and then let's continue. And then it says, as a result of the production budget increase, the equilibrium ratio of the marginal product will increase or remain the same. Since there was no effect or no change in the price ratio, therefore there won't be any effect on the equilibrium of the marginal product. Remember, there was no change in the price ratio, so it does not affect the equilibrium ratio as well of the marginal product. So here the answer will be remain the same. The marginal product will remain the same. Okay, and then let's continue. Then it says a simultaneous decrease in the price of capital and an increase in the price of labor results in a capital intensive biased capital and labor cost change, or labor intensive biased capital and labor cost change. Okay, this statement here says, given this ratio, right, if a price of capital decreases here at this point, given that we have PL over PK, and then price of capital decrease, and then and price of labor increases. Now it means that it's more, with that statement, it means it's more expensive for this company to employ labor for production than it is for this company to employ capital. That's what the statement means. So let me explain also what a capital intensive is and labor intensive is. Capital intensive suggests that a production is much cheaper when capital is employed than it is in labor. So when you say production is capital intensive, it is less expensive for that company to employ capital, and it is expensive for it to employ labor in this case. So the answer is clear in this case, that the statement would go for a capital intensive biased capital and labor cost change. Okay, when we say something is labor intensive, a production, is labor intensive, it means that it is cheaper for this production to employ labor than it is for it to employ capital, because the price of employing labor is low, but the price of employing capital is high. Hence, we say this production is labor intensive and capital biased. Right? So, labor intensive, it's cheap in the labor factor to employ it for the production. So capital intensive, it is cheaper for the company to employ capital than it is for labor. Okay, and then it continues to say a capital intensive labor cost change entails a greater or smaller labor intercept. Since we said capital intensive means that it's cheaper for the company to employ capital than it is for labor, then the labor intercept should be small. We will decrease the usage of labor and increase the usage of capital. So the labor intercept will be small in that case. And then it continues to say a labor intensive biased cost change entails a greater or smaller capital intensive. Now this statement, it simply means if now we say our production is labor intensive, obviously the intercept of capital should be small, will be small actually, because we'll employ less of capital and more of labor. So the intercept of capital will be small if the production is labor intensive. Okay, let's continue. When technological economies of scale are realized, the long-run cost curve increases at a decreasing rate or an increasing rate. The answer here will be at a decreasing rate. Remember, in the long run, since we have economies of scale, meaning that there's profit, that we will reach a point whereby our total cost curve, they are decreasing. They are increasing at a decreasing rate, not as before, like in the short run period. So at this point, if we are facing economies of scale in the long run, the total cost curve will increase but at a decreasing rate. Okay, that's it for activity 1. Now let's come to activity 2. Activity 2, we are given instruction that, okay, we're given a graph here. They say assume the following graph. This graph illustrates the impact of minimum wage on monopolists. Okay, so the first thing that you need to understand is what a monopolist is. Monopsonist, sorry. So I've given you a definition here. A monopsonist is one who is a single buyer for a product or service of many sellers. The difference between monopoly and a monopsony is primarily in the difference between the controlling entities. A single buyer dominates monopolized market, while a single or an individual seller controls a monopolized market. In this case, we are looking at a single buyer. Okay, we have wages on the vertical side and then number of labor units on the horizontal side. Now the instruction says, okay, the instruction gives us 2 assumptions. We say the first assumption is we assume that there are no wages, no minimum wages. So in this point, what would a monopsonist do? Question number 1 says, what is the wage that the monopsonist would prefer to pay? Okay, let's go to our graph. We said we assume that there are no minimum wages, right? Remember, a monopsony has similar market conditions as of a monopoly, so they focus on making profit than spending more on the market. They rather spend less while making profit, right? So they are asking, at what wage would a monopsonist prefer to pay if given that there are no minimum wages? So we look below the minimum wage because we assume that there's no minimum wage. A monopsonist would never pay at this point higher than minimum wages, but now we should look below that because the assumption says so. So our answer here would be WM. Okay, this is the wage a monopsonist would prefer to pay given that there's no minimum wage. At this wage, the monopsonist would prefer to employ this number of laborers, NM and WM, but the question just wants WM. First question, yes, this is the wage they would prefer to pay. And then number two, what is the number of employees that the monopsonist would prefer to employ? This is the number of employees. At this point of wages, this is the people that they would prefer to employ. Okay. The third question says, if it were a perfect market, would the wage paid to workers be lower or higher than the monopsonist is willing to pay? So the wages would be higher in a perfect market because in a perfect market, in the perfect market, a price is determined by the market force of demand and supply. So they would negotiate, the employer would have to negotiate with the employee the price at which they are willing to offer their service at. So it would be higher than this. It would be higher than WM and NM. WM, it would be higher. It would have to increase at a certain point because it is a perfect market. Now let's go to condition 2. We assume that there is minimum wage. So what would happen, or what is the number of employees that are willing to work at a minimum wage? Given that there are minimum wages, what is the number of people that are willing to work in that minimum wage? Okay, so we look at this point. We moved from no minimum to minimum. This is the wage, minimum wage. And then how many people are willing to work at this point? Is it N minimum? No, it cannot be. And then we go to, this is the point where they would prefer to work at. This is N1. This is the number of people that are willing to work given a minimum wage. Okay. And then the second question says, what is the number of employees that will be employed by a monopsonist? Given that there is a minimum wage, a monopsonist would prefer to employ people at this point because since there's a restriction that there should be a minimum wage, it means that the monopsonist cannot employ many people in order to cut the cost. They would rather employ at this point, you see, where minimum wage and number of labor units meet. This is the point where the monopsonist would prefer to employ, right? Okay. And then number 3, what will the impact on the employment be if the minimum wage is increased? Okay, now we say this is the minimum wage. Now what would happen if the minimum wage is increased. That's what the question is asking, right? Or in the employment. Now the monopsonist would be is restricted to increase minimum wage from this point to this point W asterisk here. So what would happen to employment? At this point, since at minimum the monopsonist was willing to employ at this point, now that now that the wage minimum increased, this person would rather move to this point. In that process, he is cutting out other employees so that he can cover the cost of paying these who are still working with a higher wage than previously. The monopsonist would cut costs, would rather get rid of other employees and take that money he used to spend on wages to those people and put it into the ones that are remaining in the company since the wages increased. Okay, so that's the question. So the employment would decrease in this essence, because the monopsonist is moving from a certain point, which is N minimum, to NM here. So the employment would decrease, meaning more people will lose their jobs. Okay, that's activity 2. Now let's go to activity 3. I hope it's clear. Let's go to activity 3. Okay, so activity 3 says, assume an isoquant map where capital is denoted on the vertical axis and labor on the horizontal axis. Okay, this is the assumption given. Capital is on the vertical axis, labor on the horizontal axis, right? And then what you need to understand here is what an isoquant is. Okay, previously we discussed that an isoquant shows all combination of two factors that produce a given output in the diagram. The isoquant shows all the combination of labor and capital that can be produced, that can produce a total output, right? So the inputs here is capital and labor. So let's answer the questions then. The first question says, what will happen to MRTS if less units are employed? Okay, MRTS, remember, it may be understood as the rate at which one factor input can be substituted for the other factor input. Since we have two factors here, which is capital and labor, the rate at which maybe capital can be substituted for labor or labor can be substituted for capital. That's what in MRTS can be understood as. Okay, so we are asked if what would happen if MRTS if less labor units are employed. Okay, let's go to our graph. Let's say we're at point B. At point B, we're at K2 and L2. At this point, okay, I've given figures here. We assume that K1 is 18, K2 is 12, K3 is 10. L1 is 8, L2 is 12, L3 is 15. Okay, so we said we were at this point B. If we employ less of, what's the question says? If we employ less of labor, it means that we were here. We assume that we were here and then we employ less of labor. It means we shift from labor L2 to labor L1. we shift to point A. Then what would happen to the MRTS? Okay, so our MRTS would be, let's calculate it. At point B, we said we shift from point B to point A. At point B, we were at L2, and at point A, we were at L1. Now let's check what was our slope at this point. Okay, so we do that by saying at point B, sorry, we are between L2 and L3. L2 is 12 and L3 is 15. So the difference between 15 and 12 is 3, right? So this is, remember guys, please note this, the slope of this graph here will be change in capital over change in labor. Change in capital over change in labor. So let's look for change in capital at point B. So we're between K2 and K3. The difference between K2 and K3 is here. This is K3, this is K2. So the difference is 2. Here it's noted here. It's 2 over, and then the difference between L2 and L3 is 3. Therefore, change in capital over change in labor will be 2 over 3, which is 0.66. This is at point B. Please note that this is at point B. The reason why I said L2 and L3, we look at this small triangle here. This is the first point, second point, and the third point. A change happens between K2 and K3 here, and then L2 and L3. Then you calculate that, you're gonna get 0.66, which is 2.3, right? And then at point A, we also need to calculate our slope. At point A, we are at K1 and K2. Let's check the difference between K1 and K2. K1 is 18 and K2 is 12. So what is the difference between 12 and 18? Which is 6, right? 18 minus 12 is 6. And then at this point S, from S to B, what's the difference between L1 and L2? L2 is 12, L1 is 8. So 12 minus 8 is 4. Hence we have 6 divided by 4, which is equals to 1.5. This is the MRTS at point A. This is the MRTS at point B. So what happens when you move from this point to that point? You move away from, or you move from 0.66 to 1.5. So there's an increase in the MRTS. From point B to point A, you are increasing the MRTS. When you decrease the units of labor, you employ more of capital, and then that's what happens to the MRTS. Hence why I wrote increase here. The second question is, what will happen to the ratio of marginal products if less units of capital are employed? Now we say we're at point A. Remember, at point A, our MRTS is 1.5. Now, what will happen if we employ less of capital? We shift from point A to point B. At point B, remember at point A, we had 1.5 MRTS. Now at point B, we have 0.66 MRTS, meaning that now it decreases, right? The marginal product will decrease. Remember guys, slope is change in capital over change in labor, which is the same as marginal product of labor over marginal product of capital. All this thing is also equals to the MRTS of capital and labor. So when they ask what happens to marginal product, you should also check, if you can check the slope. The slope is the same as the marginal product, which is the same as MRTS. Okay, so it will decrease at this point. And then third question says, would long run average cost increase or decrease when decreasing returns to scale is experienced? Okay, at this point, when facing decreased returns to scale, it means that our costs are increasing at a certain rate. So average cost will increase at this point. This is what we mean here. And then the next question says, assume that the cost of capital input increases. And then what, okay, while other things remain constant, what would happen to the equilibrium MRTS? Increase or decrease? We said we assume that capital input increases. We were at this point, and then we increase capital, the employment of capital, to point A. We're at point B, we move back to point A. What will happen to the equilibrium? Remember, equilibrium is where the two factors are used equally, are employed equally in the production. Okay, let's look at these figures here. The equilibrium point, look at K2 and L2. This would be our equilibrium point, because given the assumption I assumed on my own that K1 is 18, K2 is 12. Look at if K2 is 12, and then also L2 is 12 here. See, then we are at equilibrium point. We assume that the usage of capital is equal to the usage of labor for this production, right? So they ask, if you move from this point to this point, will there be how will that affect equilibrium? Obviously, equilibrium will decrease. There will not be an equilibrium in this point. So we are at disequilibrium because more capital is employed than labor. There is no equilibrium at this point, right? So equilibrium will decrease. And then the next question says, assume that you are employing less units of capital. What impact would this have on the MRTS? Okay. Employing less of capital. We were at this point, now we are decreasing to this point. Obviously, we said the MRTS will decrease. Okay, so MRTS at point A, we had 1.5. Now when we go to point B, we have 0.66. There's a decrease between those two movements there, from point A to point B. Okay. And then the last question says, will the slope of the isoquant be relatively flat or steep if the elasticity of substitution is of the firm is low? The answer will be the isoquant the slope of the isoquant will be steep. This is what I did here to show you a steeper line. This is steep. Okay, this is steep and this is flatter. So when they say when they say elasticity of substitution is low, it means that they do not substitute. The substitution effect is not really high for the both inputs that are employed for that certain output. Therefore, the slope will be steeper instead of being flatter. It means that they are not flexible in uh, in 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 employing the these inputs in a most effective and cheap way, I can say. Yes, that's all, guys, and thank you for watching videos. You know, you can email us your tutors at any time you have questions. Okay, that's it for now. You will get activity 4, 5 and 6 on the next video. Okay.